Good story-driven games are really rare these days. I'm not talking your typical RPGs or MMOs where there's a story tacked in to complement the gameplay. I'm talking about games where the gameplay is designed to complement the story. Back in 2019, when I reviewed the original Plague Tale: Innocence, it wasn't a very well-known title. There wasn't a lot of hype for it, and I didn't know much at all going in and had no expectations for it in the slightest. It was one of those games that had a quiet release that wasn't on very many people's radars. To be frank, I'm glad I reviewed it because it ended up being one of the best story-driven games I've ever played. The entire concept of hordes of rats swarming around and devouring flesh from bone like land piranhas is terrifying. It was something that wasn't done before, and I felt like the game captured the raw essence and horror of what was transpiring. The characters and story were the focus of the first game, with everything else being a side dish to the narrative that was being told. All of the game's mechanics and visuals were there to lend aid to what was happening to the two main characters, Amicia and Hugo, and it genuinely drew me in and inspired me to play all the way through. Sequels are rough. Typically, when you do something bold and new and capture a very specific magic, it's almost impossible to continue with that in a second title. Developers tend to go too far and add too many things that muddle and dilute the original formula, making a title lose identity between releases. I didn't want this for the sequel to the first game in the series. I wanted more of the same, but with a bigger budget and further development of the characters that I came to love and enjoy from the first title. The question is though, did Asobo accomplish this in a Plague Tale: Requiem? Story-wise, this game continues immediately after the events of the first one. Amicia is with her mother and Hugo desperately trying to cure the macula that has consistently summoned vicious hordes of destructive man-eating rats. They've decided to work with an order of alchemists that are extremely familiar with the disease, embarking on a journey to get in touch with said individuals and hopefully free Hugo from the curse once and for all. Along their path, they encounter many obstacles and come to disturbing realizations, really pushing the characters, Amicia specifically, to confront hard moral choices that will end up defining who they are and what they stand for. They also end up getting extensive PTSD due to being exposed to far more horrifying rat-related situations. I mean, like, really messed up situations.
Please don't hurt me!
Calm down! We're not with those men! You live here?
Yes!
Oh, shit!
What is that? They're here!
Don't drop the torch! As long as you have it, they can't hurt you!
What do they want with me?
Come to us! We have to go back up! The sun will protect us!
Calm down! You're safe with the light! Alright! Where did they come from? There's more coming!
A lot more! Keep moving!
Too many! Don't stop!
Ignore them! Keep moving!
Yes!
Straight up though, I gotta get this out first and foremost because it bothers me the most. I feel like they really stumbled when it came to the development of the characters throughout the game's main story. My biggest gripe with this is the fact that it feels like said characters are repeating the exact same story arcs they did in the first game, as if the first game in their development as people never happened. Amicia went through the transformation of losing her innocence in the first game throughout her entire experience. She went from someone who was terrified to an individual who was stalwart in her dedication and decision to protect Hugo. This involved killing people and coming to terms with the fact that she was killing, while grasping wholeheartedly the idea that some people had to die so that others may live. By the end of the game, I wouldn't necessarily call her a hardened killing machine, but she definitely was mature in that sense. Requiem seems to completely forget about her development as a character. The entire game seems to grapple around her once again being stunned about murdering and being violent, and having her incredibly shaken through every situation. To me, Amicia's development should have already been done. Constantly putting her in situations she's been in dozens of times before and having her act like they're completely new to her was not the direction they should have gone. They took a strong character and tore her back down to the beginning for the sake of drama, and it feels like she lost a lot of her identity because of that. Characters breaking down and being human in new and terrifying situations is something I'm completely okay with. I'm okay with the drama when they're experiencing something for the first time because you can understand what they're going through. More than once, and honestly I'd say closer to a dozen times in this game, Amicia seems to break down, have panic attacks, massive anxiety issues, and freak out over things she's already experienced before, and that's my biggest gripe. The story as a whole isn't bad, don't get me wrong. I'd say it's great for what it is, but this single point continually pulled me out of immersion throughout my playthrough because I was constantly going, dude, come on. You've been through this 700 times. Why are you acting this way when it just doesn't make sense for her character? Visually though, the game's a complete upgrade from the first title. The lighting is better, the environments are more detailed, and it's definitely what would be considered a glow up in today's standards. Character models are incredibly detailed down to the finest points of their outfits. NPCs are all unique for the most part and not copy pasted, and the cities themselves feel and look like actual cities. They spared absolutely no expense in trying to make this game look great, even down to the mud that's tracked around with footprints due to foot traffic. It's actually wild how breathtaking it can look at times. Personally, I thought the nature scenes were the best visual spectacles, with everything just so bright and vibrant and the god rays doing so much for these layouts. Max, you'd put flowers in a field, pretty thing here, do. That isn't to say it's visually all bright, however, as the dark and morbid areas of Requiem are impressive horrors as well. I can safely say without a doubt that there were multiple scenes where the detail of the gore and the disgustingness of the situation Amicia was in really got to me. One example is wading through a shallow pool filled with debris, dead rats, and cadavers, an extremely intense scene where I found myself actually gagging at the level of detail they put in. Seriously, those parts are so gross, and there's a lot of them that will cause the same effect on the average player. Requiem just does such a good job at creating these beautiful scenes and then destroying them with plagues of rats and the horrors that come with, which leads into the rats themselves. They look so good in this. You can tell that this plague has evolved and gotten worse, as there are literal tidal waves of rats that just eat and destroy everything in their path. It's harrowing to watch entire scores of villagers and people in general just getting stripped of their flesh to the bones by vermin. Absolute A+++ material and how they did it. There's nothing quite as striking as a sea of rats tearing down buildings and castles, really showing that when they say millions of rats, there are actually millions of rats on screen at a time. I don't know how they managed to do this without absolutely tanking the game's performance, but they did, so props to the devs on that. Performance itself is solid, even on Ultra, at least on PC with a decent setup. I was able to maintain 60 FPS on my mid-tier system on like average graphics, rocking a 2060, an older series Intel processor, with my Steam Deck handling the game just fine as well in its downscaled state. There were times on the Steam Deck where it dropped to 40 to 50 frames, especially during the rat escapes, but overall I had no complaints and it translated well. All of the audio in this game is superb. Characters correctly convey emotions, and conversations in town sound like actual people talking, something which normally doesn't land in video games these days. The ambience and general feel of everything in an audio sense lands flawlessly, assisting in propping up the stunning visuals that you are constantly assaulted with. Specifically, I'd say out of all the audio, that the sounds the rats make in every capacity were my favorite, with that squeaking, rumbling horror tidal wave really making me shiver whenever you heard it. The game does so well at audio cues for what's going on and when things are happening, you'll completely understand what I mean if I check it out. Every time you hear that rumble, you know shit's about to hit the fan, and they do a great job at setting up silence before the storm in that regard frequently. It's crazy how much good audio adds to a scene when transitioning from a tranquil and peaceful moment to complete chaos, and God, Plague Tale Requiem does this flawlessly. Another huge plus for me. Gameplay is very much the same as the first game, with a lot of extra bells and baubles added in. They essentially took everything that they had as a framework in Innocence and improved on it in Requiem in all of the right ways and none of the bad. Everything you do is in third person and will always stay that way, with the exception of the rat powers later on, and it feels well designed and not at all in any way I'd consider janky. Amicia controls well and does what you want her to, in both in movement and aiming, and the parkour system in the game works the way it should without any hindrance. There's returning stealth mechanics with bushes and hiding in or under objects, all of which makes complete sense and never feels punishing or mandatory in the slightest. Aiming your various devices, weapons, and gadgets uses the tried and true method of LB or right clicking, allowing you to zoom in and focus on what you want to do. At no point did I struggle with this, and I'd say it's much smoother than the first title for sure. One of my favorite things I loved about the first game was the sheer number of ways you could approach each and every situation that Amicia found herself in. You always had the option of sneaking through without death, with death, or full-on assaulting, with each option also having the added factor of rats being involved. This game improves on all of those styles. Light plays a huge role in Requiem and is probably the biggest focus of how your playstyle will go. You've got various alchemical reagents and items at your disposal that affect it, from Extinguish that lets you remove light from torches to cause rats to swarm people, and in the opposite end, Tar and Pyrite that triples and quadruples the effectiveness of light sources to repel the rats. It all blends flawlessly into whatever style you choose while you play, allowing you to pick and choose if you want to who lives and who gets devoured by rats at any given moment. It's intuitive too. A section that's incredibly difficult to do with stealth will be stupidly easy to do if you use the rats to kill everyone. There's no punishment for doing either, and it always allows a player to choose how it goes down. Personally, I went the route of just murder and mayhem with the rats as my allies, almost constantly killing people with my sling and disabling torches whenever I could to get the rats to devour bodies and be distracted by corpses. It was a lot of fun. While traversing levels, you're going to get a lot of materials, as both crafting and upgrades have returned in the sequel. In the first game, I'd say they weren't much of a hindrance or focus, with shortages in equipment or consumables only occurring if you were dumb with when and how you utilize said things. This is very much still the case, probably to even a lesser extent, as the game just throws these materials at you nonstop, and I don't think at any point I ever ran out of anything at all. I always was, if I explored properly, able to craft whatever I wanted until my heart was content, really enabling me to continue playing how I wanted through each and every situation. None of the upgrades felt mandatory either, with the upgrades themselves all being focused on individual aspects of Amicia's kit. Some of the upgrades would increase your storage capacity for devices, while others upgraded your sling. These things were all fairly arbitrary and more of a quality of life upgrade rather than necessities. One of the nicer ones to get early on is definitely the unlimited durability tool, negating the cost of upgrading things with tools entirely and allowing you to eventually get each and every one. They all just add a little bit of flavor to your playstyle, and that's awesome. Nothing is excessively broken or out of place, and there's really no need to use any of them if you don't want to. Skills in Requiem are gained by how you play this time around, with Amicia gaining perks through what you do in each segment or area. Stealth perks, for example, typically revolve around sneaking faster, making less noise, or being able to silently eliminate people, while the aggression perks focus on stuff like pushing people into fire or enabling the killing of ultra heavily armored soldiers with knives. I'll come right out and say I enjoyed this. It's nice to see the character develop towards how she's acting rather than what a player chooses through a point system. I personally found that I leveled my alchemy stuff the fastest by constantly using Extinguish or Flame or whatever other crafting gadgets to kill and progress intuitively, but it's really a to each their own on what you try to level and which perks you try to obtain. There are a couple of new gadgets in Requiem, the most useful of which being the crossbow, a device that allows you to straight kill normally unkillable enemies at a distance with extremely limited ammo. Sure, straight murder and mayhem in this game is a bit different than the first, but that's all right. They really escalate the number of enemies you're trying to keep track of, and there's times where you just have to kill at least one or two to progress. The crossbow does this great. It's also got compatibility with some of your alchemical tools, and that's neat. However, this mostly only comes into play with some puzzles. Without a doubt, however, the coolest gameplay mechanics in Requiem come from when you're controlling the rats with Hugo. Hugo's kind of a badass in this game when you do get to control rats, and boy is it satisfying to aim the swarms in general directions and wipe out anything in your path. It's such a simple concept done so beautifully, almost like controlling water, with a lot of the puzzles requiring the use of rats to progress to the next area later on in the story. Seriously, take a look at what it's like to eliminate guards with rats and tell me this isn't one of the coolest things you've ever seen in a story-driven game. Overall, I'd say A Plague Tale Requiem is a pretty solid successor to the first game. I don't necessarily agree with the story direction, but everything else I could safely say is straight up an improvement. So let's break down the final score now. Gameplay gets an 8 out of 10. It's nothing genre defining, but everything you do is well done. There's nothing janky and it's completely open for the player to decide how to progress. It's great. Story gets a 7 out of 10. It was good, but God did I like the character regression on Amicia. It was actually annoying as hell and constantly pulled me away from the rest of what was going on. Graphics get a 9 out of 10. They're superb. Everything about this game oozes in quality in a visual sense, and it has some of the best grotesque scenes to date. Amazing. Audio gets a 9 out of 10. The only thing missing is a banger soundtrack to pull it to that 10 out of 10. Everything else is perfect, and the audio fits perfectly with the visuals at every point. And finally, value gets an 8 out of 10. The game is about 15 to 20 hours long, depending on your first playthrough, and isn't at all what I'd call disappointing. If you liked the first one, the price of $49.99 isn't too much at all. It's worth it. This is going to leave me to give A Plague Tale Requiem sequel to Innocence a solid 8 out of 10. It's a great game that I think anyone who is a fan of narrative-driven experiences should pick up and enjoy. It's one of those games that leaves you satisfied and content with how things went down, and I have no issue at all suggesting it to the average player as a title you should pick up. Plus, hey, is there any other game where you can control millions of rats with your mind? Check it out. Anyway, that's going to be it for this review. If you liked the video, hit that freaking like button and share this review around, post it on forums, Reddit, wherever, Twitter. And, otherwise, if you got nothing to do, go back and watch other videos and let me know down in the comments down below what games in the future you'd like me to cover. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, this is Delrith, and I'll be seeing ya. Bye.